Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you are safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. I guess today, I can think of no more important regional issue than Iran. As the Arab world appears to be in a relatively high state of dysfunction, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, the three non-Arabs, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, seem to be the only states in the region with a capacity to project their military power beyond their borders, both for good and for ill. And even though Iran's power may have been somewhat weakened over the course of the last year and a half as a consequence of the damage done by Israel to their proxies and Iran's own vulnerabilities as a consequence of Israeli military strikes, I suspect, if not for proxies, then the issue of Iran's nuclear program is going to remain not just a conversation piece in this region, but an issue of critical importance, and may well actually have a lot to do with maintaining regional stability or confrontation. We have 45 minutes, which is never enough time, and the time's going to go fast. I want to cover three basic questions. Number one, what motivates Iran's foreign policy and national security strategy? Number two, what's changed over the last 18 months? Much has, with respect to Iranian power or vulnerability. And finally, the Trump administration and its policy on Iran. How is Iran reading the Trump administration? What are the chances of an agreement? What kind of an agreement? Fortunately for me, today and most days, I don't have to answer any of these questions. But we have two extraordinary panelists to help us unpack these puzzlers. Suzanne Maloney is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where her research focuses on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. Prior to being named Vice President and Director, Suzanne served as the Deputy Director of Foreign Policy for 5 years. She also serves on the External Research Council for the National Intelligence Council, the NIC, and is a frequent commentator in national and international media. Vali Nasr is the Majid Khadduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Between 2012 and 2019, he served as the Dean of the school, and between 2009 and 2011, he served as the senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. Vali is also the author of several books, including the one that's just out or available now, Vali?
Yep. Yes.
I started reading it. It's fascinating. And I'd urge everyone with an interest in Iran to think about definitely looking into it. Vali was also selected as the Henry Alfred Kissinger Resident Scholar at the Library of Congress between 2024 and 2025. So let's begin with the first question. You know, as a former intelligence analyst, I usually start with a presumption that effective U.S. policy is almost always dependent on assessing the foreign actor of the situation at hand. My Carnegie colleague, the inestimable Karim Sajjapour, has argued that much of the Islamic Republic's identity has been premised since the revolution on opposing the U.S. And that presumption is based on the fact that Iran's opposition is both ideological and security-based, primarily the desire for regime and revolutions and the revolution's self-preservation. Vali, you've just come out with the new book. I'll show it again. You were asked in a recent interview what the big idea behind the book was. And I'm encapsulating, but I'll quote directly. Essentially, you said, I argue that we must understand the Islamic Republic of Iran today, how it looks to its population at home and how it acts abroad, not in terms of its founding ideology, but primarily as a product of the evolution of a grand strategy that is driven by the leadership's conception of national security. I wonder, well, if you could unpack that and elaborate a bit.
Well, the Islamic Republic is a product of the revolution of 1979, which was an ideological revolution. But at the same time, that ideology set Iran on a collision course with the United States, and that has produced threat perceptions and a particular view of national security in Iran, which dominates. In other words, this is not a culture war anymore for Iran. It's much more about preservation of the system, preservation of the country, preservation of the revolution, which in the mind of its leadership are not separate from one another. The leadership of Iran sees Iran, Islamic Republic, and the legacy of the revolution as the same thing. And it sees the United States as the greatest threat to Iran's national security. And regardless of where this began, it essentially has a theory about how it needs to protect itself against that. And in addition, there's 40 years of experience that Iran has had in war, in confronting the US, in aggressive behavior in the region, in defending itself, that is cumulatively now part of its national security experience. So we have to take Iran, I believe, not in the sense that everything is explained by the fact that it's a theocracy, and therefore somehow religion and ideology decides how they see the world, but see it essentially as any other adversary we look at, Russia, North Korea, China, etc., regardless of the original ideology, that it is driven by national interest and threat perception. Those might be illogical or misplaced, but they are secular in nature. They are not explained through the lens of ideology.
Yeah. So let me just press you a bit on that. So ideology then is a tool rather than, it's become an instrument rather than a key motivator of Iran's ambitions, its view of the world, its role in the region?
Well, ideology is sort of the bedrock, if you would, of the Islamic Republic, and it's it is part of its even conception of nationalism, etc. But I think the Islamic Republic today needs ideology more, in the sense of having its population on its side, or trying to have its population on its side, of being able to create legitimacy for even the foreign policy that it's pursuing, rather than just being an instrument of that ideology. So in a way, if you look back at, say, formative event for the Islamic Republic, which is the Iran-Iraq War, the conception is that they did well in that war largely because they had the population supporting the regime, is willing to sacrifice for the war. Why did it sacrifice for the war? Was because there was an ideological bond that connected the regime to the people, which is now today lacking in Iran. But essentially, the Islamic Republic, in waging war in the Levant, in Persian Gulf, in resisting the United States, needs ideology. And so it's not as simple to say that ideology drives the system.
Right.
Also the other way around. Iran now has a national security policy that needs ideology, and that's exactly the Achilles heel of everything Iran is doing. It's following a foreign policy that no longer has popular support.
Right. Suzanne, let me turn to you now. How do you see the balance? Or maybe is it a balance? It's not ideology versus national security. It's ideology and national security that motivates Iranian policy. But where do you come out on the issue of ideology as a functional tool? What does it serve? What does it do for Iran?
Thanks, Aaron, and I'm glad to be here. And I think that it's important that we actually try to disaggregate ideology as a driver versus ideology as a tool. I'm not sure that I come out in the same place as Vali seems to be arguing at this point. I think that there is a temptation, especially when it comes to aging revolutionary regimes, whether it's Iran or China or other states around the world, to kind of presume that there is some rationalization over time, and that pragmatism and regime survival take precedence. I think obviously those are both qualities that we see in Iranian foreign policy from the beginning and increasingly more recently. But I think it's also important to recognize that the ideology remains an important component, both of how Iranian leaders see the world, in the way that they explain the world and the threats that they perceive to their own citizens, and in the way that they align themselves with other powers and pursue the strategy that they might have. And so I think it would be mistaken to try to suggest that ideology no longer matters to the Islamic Republic, that ideology is not a formative component of what drives this regime. It is certainly also, as Vali said, part of the conception of regime survival relies on being able to make that case. Its legitimacy is grounded in its anti-Americanism. But it is an ideology that is increasingly unpopular with the Iranian people. Now, foreign policy is typically not made by poll, and certainly not made by public assent in a country whose government isn't subject to any real democratic accountability. But I think that this is one of the tensions that we see with Iran today, that you have a young population which wants engagement with the world, which is aware of the world around it, and whose regime is very much remains grounded in this conception of good versus evil, of a great Satan and other smaller Satans that are somehow the root of all evil in the world, and that Iran's fundamental purpose is to try to align itself against those powers. It hasn't served the Islamic Republic very well. It certainly hasn't served the national interests of the people of Iran very well to adopt that kind of an adversarial position and to cling to the ideological foundations of the regime, even if it does serve the interests of the leadership itself in terms of staying in power.
Oh, again, I'm not. Let me try to get at it this way, and maybe it's a conflation that's simply impossible to separate out. Karen Armstrong wrote a book called The History of God, and her main contention essentially was that man believes in God because God, I think we've lost Suzanne. Suzanne, do you hear me? Hopefully we'll get her back. Man believes in God because God works for man. God is functional. That's right. In essence. Suzanne, do you hear that? So I guess I'd ask both of you again to be a little more specific in terms of what function does ideology serve? Is it a tool of national mobilization, even though it may be an increasingly ineffective tool? Is it a tool to gain the hearts and minds of other like-minded regional actors, Death to Israel, the Great Satan, and all the rest of it? And if it's not working, what are the prospects as Iran becomes more and more focused on its national security? Ideology can't be requited. National security interests could actually be transacted and resolved. If Iran was just a national security state, arguably, you could address its national security issues and it would somehow evolve and be more secure. So again, we'll leave this in a minute, and I hope I'm not beating this into the ground. But I think it's really, really important because America's assessment of Iran is heavily influenced by its ideological veneer or its core. I don't know what is what here.
Well, if I may take a stab at it first, I think that what's important for our foreign policy is that often we overemphasize ideology as if we're dealing with Islamic Republic of 20 years ago or 30, 40 years ago. And so first of all, we have to take note of both the changes among the population, as Suzanne said, but also in the mind of the leadership. I mean, the subtlety is this. There's a time when you would say that Iran wanted to go to Lebanon because of ideology, because it wanted to export this revolution. But then if you say the objective is for whatever reason that they want to pick a fight with Israel, they want to contain Israel, they want to deter, they want to be aggressive, they need to be in Lebanon. And in order to justify being in Lebanon, they need to emphasize Shia brotherhood, these sorts of themes. Or that to mobilize their population or a segment of their population, they need the ideology. There is a subtle, if you would, shift in terms of, is it ideology that is driving their behavior, or is it they're now locked into a certain kind of behavior, which is, it's costly, as Suzanne said. It doesn't make sense, and it's definitely not paying dividend. But that kind of a behavior needs ideology because they got a lot of dividend out of that in the 80s and the 90s when they justified their behavior ideologically. Now, I think we're at a particular juncture in time where all of these issues, even within Iran, I don't mean only for Supreme Leader, Revolutionary Guard commanders, but among the political class, the intelligentsia, etc., is up to debate. Clearly, it's not working. The population is not with them. You're not going to get much mobilization out of ideology. But the core national security interest, and security interest here, David, is not just threat perception. It's a particular view of nationalism. I mean, is Russia really threatened? But if you have a conception of nationalism and security that is inclusive of having a big footprint in your near abroad, then that's the driving force. So we have to look at the fact that the decision makers in Iran are driven by a particular, foreign policy perspective, let's put it that way, which we're not going to easily transact out of. I don't want to simplify it.
Right.
But it's not a matter of religion. It's a matter of the dark way in which they see their national aspirations and calculate threats.
Suzanne?
I think Vali's right to, make a distinction between religion and ideology with respect to the Islamic Republic. Clearly, the Islamic Republic's the ideology that motivated Khomeini was not purely theocratic. It was influenced by a number of other philosophical and political and social tendencies. And the state that was built and the policies that has followed are very much a sort of distinct nationalist version of an interpretation of Islam. So it's not a theocracy in that sense. But I also think, we diminish the role of ideology at our peril when it comes to thinking about how Iran sees the world and how its leaders behave and engage with the world. And to me, there are just simple tests. Can we imagine a world in which Khamenei could ever participate in a handshake with an American of any background, much less an American leader? Can we imagine a world in which the head of the Revolutionary Guard could meet with and publicly acknowledge an American counterpart? That core root of anti-Americanism is not a kind of Shia precept. It's not a religious precept, but it is very much an ideological dimension of Iranian foreign policy that they have remained fairly devoted to, even at a time where we've seen significant changes again within the country, but also significant changes in the way that other revolutionary states engage with old adversaries. The fact that the Islamic Republic relies on this adversarial relationship with the United States as a justification for its repressive policies at home, as a rationalization of its investment in proxy militias around the world, and of course, as a justification for the nuclear program, which is a topic that I'm sure you also want to talk about today, Aaron.
I do, and I'm going to ask you each later a simple question about what function does a nuclear program actually solve? What problem, what challenges overcome for the regime? But just to move on with one additional comment, I guess I'd say, and I guess two of you would agree that to a large extent, Iran is really stuck. If the preeminent national security objective of any state, or let's say of an authoritarian state, is the preservation of the regime, and if the regime is ideological, which the regime is for any number of reasons, then in fact, whether it's ideologically motivated or nationally security motivated, you more or less end up in the same place, because the image that Iran is projecting is not of a pragmatic status quo power, even though I think there's probably more to that in Iranian policy than people would acknowledge. But maybe we'll come around to this when we get to the third issue, which is Iran's view of the Trump administration and its nuclear program. A brief discussion, because things never remain quite the same, of how the last 18 months, primarily what I would argue would be Israel's escalation dominance, has affected Iran. Israel can now control the pace, the intensity, the focus of its military actions against its principal rivals, with the exception of the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and even Iran. those three actors cannot escalate against Israel. Or if they can, it will come at a severe price. So Israel more or less has established escalation dominance. How has that impacted Iran's calculations with respect to the region and our next subject, which is prostrate for a negotiated deal? So Vali, let me start with you.
I think it's actually a very significant development. It's not just that Israel has got the escalation domination, but also as of April of last year, it became very clear that whatever deterrence value Iran's presence in the Levant had, it was no longer working. So when Israel actually hit Iran's consulate in Damascus, it showed that it's willing to cross lines that Iran assumed Israel wouldn't do because of fear of Hezbollah. So if Israel was no longer at that point in time afraid of what Hezbollah might do or what Iran's presence in Syria might do, meant that the strategy was already bankrupt. And in fact, that's why Iran decided to retaliate by missiles rather than to retaliate through Lebanon. So the whole thing began to, I think, collapse from that point on. And then the physical elimination of Iran's footprint in the Levant, because, Hezbollah has been battered. Hamas is, just a pale shell right now, and its footprint in Syria is gone, meant that at least a major pillar of Iran's sort of not only regional presence, but national security, again, the way in which it thought it would manage the US and Israel, deter against them, push back against them, prod them, bully them, whatever way you want to put it, it's no longer operable. So I think we're in a situation where I don't think the Iranians themselves know what comes next. And the ways it has changed things, I think there's a serious debate, even within the revolutionary guards, within the security elite, about how do they manage things going forward. I think it has a lot to do with their willingness to cut a nuclear deal at this point in time to arrive at stabilization. It has a lot to do with the deepening of Iran-Arab diplomatic relations, although the Arabs have their own motivations, but so do the Iranians. So essentially, it's the end of an era. An era that began in 2003 with Iran and the forward defense and success in Iran going to Syria, assuming that they could basically project power in the Arab world, control Israel, push back against the US. That has now ended. And I don't think there is a ready blueprint of what replaces it. It's happened too quickly and too suddenly. And that's, I think, exactly the reason why Israel is pushing to press its advantage at this point in time to get even more out of this moment than has happened.
Yeah. Suzanne, I know you've worried about underestimating or overestimating Iran's vulnerabilities. What's your take on the last 18 months? Has it constrained and or accelerated Iran's search for an alternative strategy to the one they've been pursuing since 2003?
Well, I think Vali is absolutely right that we've seen the end of an era, and I would add to the litany of setbacks that Iran has suffered the fact that the Israelis were able to take out key nodes of Iran's air defense system in their attacks in October of 24, which has essentially created what the strategic establishment in Israel sees as a window of opportunity to put the nuclear issue out of commission for a very long time. And that's why you see this debate rearing once again about the possibility of an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program. That the conditions have never been as favorable to such a strike as they are today, with one exception, of course, that exception being the readiness of the American president to support an Israeli operation. And I think that is a key distinction. And it is also why you hear the debate with such intensity. But Aaron, as you noted, I think that we have to be careful to assume that the threat of Iran has receded in a way that is durable. As Vali said, this is the end of an era that began with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. But the setbacks that Iran has suffered over these past 18 months have been from a kind of historic high. Iran's ability to target both Israel and American interests and presence in the Middle East over the course of the war in Gaza and even in the months that preceded it, I think was something that we really hadn't witnessed for a very long time. The degree of sort of action with impunity for the Iranian security establishment and its proxy allies was extraordinary, and the effectiveness that it had in terms of actually shrinking the borders of Israel and contributing to a worldwide debate that has led to, I think, at least the perception by some in Iran and perhaps some elsewhere that Israel has become delegitimized in some Western capitals. And so the Iranians are certainly not at that high point now. They have been significantly set back in terms of that regional presence and regional freedom of maneuver. But let's be clear, they still have proxies. They have been set back in the past, whether it was in the 2006 war in Lebanon, whether it was in previous points in time in their history. They have had much less, much smaller assets and done a great deal of damage over the years. And so I am hesitant to assume that the Iranians are down and out. I think they also look at the relationships that they've developed with allies in the Gulf, as well as the strategic partnerships that they have with both Beijing and Moscow. And they see a certain degree of survivability in those types of relationships that simply didn't exist in the past. So they are weaker in many senses within the region. They may be stronger in terms of their own sense of durability of the regime.
I mean, the segue clearly to the next subject, the will we or won't we reach an agreement, is, I guess, precisely that point. Have the Iranians reached a point where an agreement is mandatory, compulsory, discretionary? That question, I think, is yet to be answered. So let's move into that, the issue of negotiations. Now, I'm going to ask you both a flat out question here. I've been around negotiations for a while, and I must say, impressed would be probably the wrong word. I guess I'm stunned by the fact that in 5 rounds of negotiation, I gave an interview at Wall Street Journal where I described Stephen Witkoff as the envoy for everything. Stephen Witkoff is, in fact, the envoy for everything. He has the trust of the president. He succeeded in the one enterprise in human endeavors that Donald Trump respects the most, which is the making of money. But in 5 rounds of negotiations in Oman and Rome, I mean, maybe you've divined or intuited exactly what is the work that U.S. and Iranian negotiators, directly and indirectly, are working on. The degree of operational security on this is stunning, given the potential for leaks and a range of other intelligence organizations that are trying desperately, presumably including our own, to ferret out exactly what is taking place in these negotiations. What's the project at hand? Vali.
Well, I think both sides clearly, for reasons of their own, are very interested in a deal and sort of approach this in a big way. But in reality, part of the problem is that the U.S. really didn't engage in anything that resembles negotiations until the 3rd round. He wasn't prepared. I mean, Steve Witkoff didn't even have a team. I mean, he has all the authority, but did not have the knowledge, was not ready for negotiations. Just to go for a day and sort of have a get to know you meeting was not a substitute. And even as we're talking, they still don't have an agreement on a framework in terms of what is the end goal here. This debate about whether it's zero enrichment or some enrichment, is it going to be a different version of JCPOA, or Iran hands everything over, to me suggests that they actually they really haven't even got to technical details, which has to only basically begin after you agree on that framework. It's only in the last round or so that the U.S. has given Iran a proposal, and the round before that, the Iranians gave a proposal. So they give these proposals, they take it back to the respective capitals. So I think partly the issue is that the U.S. was not as prepared in terms of having a negotiating team, structure, etc., And we're only beginning to get to that phase. And partly it is maybe there's not much to ferret out in a sense, because there's not really a detailed negotiation other than to say that the US is still expecting zero enrichment, and the Iranians are trying to come up with solutions that would allow them to retain the right and yet make concessions to the US.
Yeah. Suzanne, a thought on process? I have a thought on this, but what do you think is going on in these negotiations?
To be a fly on the wall, I imagine it's a very interesting set of conversations. Look, I think, what's striking to me is that the optics are all very positive from both sides, that you're hearing, US and Iranian negotiators essentially trying to keep a sense of momentum, even if, as Vali said, it's unclear that there's been any serious discussion about the very deep and complicated technical issues that are going to have to be addressed if we're going to get to any kind of an agreement. Even a framework really requires a level of expertise on the complexities of Iran's nuclear infrastructure that it's not clear that the lead negotiators from the United States actually can command. But I think the optics are positive, and both sides trying to keep it positive says something good, because I think we all recognize that there are no good solutions to Iran's nuclear ambitions other than some kind of a negotiated agreement. Most, I think, felt that the decision to walk away from the deal in 2018 was a catastrophic one. It has certainly brought Iran closer to nuclear weapons capability than was ever envisaged under the JCPOA, and far closer than Iran was at the time that the Obama administration, together with European and great power partners, negotiated that agreement. So we are in a very dangerous situation. Negotiations are positive. I'm glad that they're happening. I think that, there is a sense from the Iranian side that, this may be an opportunity for them to, sort of get away with something, to give very little and get a lot from the United States, in part because the president himself is very eager for his Nobel Prize moment. He's also just very eager for negotiated success. He came into office saying he was going to resolve the wars in Gaza and in Ukraine with the snap of a fingers, and that has not happened. And so this may be the one chance that President Trump himself has to kind of claim a big victory. And the Iranians might be prepared to do a few things, but they certainly won't be prepared to do as much as they did in 2015, and they won't be prepared to do what at least some members of the Trump administration have suggested as a prerequisite, which would be complete denuclearization. That's not in the cards.
It's just something about this just doesn't add up. I mean, you guys are going to forget more about these issues than I'm ever going to know, but you have a situation in which you have 4 or 5 core issues. You have the issue of enrichment. Will they enrich at what levels? You have the issue of their centrifuges. What happens to them, particularly the advanced centrifuges? You have the issue of inspections. There was a report, Reuters, this morning that said the Iranians might be prepared to accept American inspectors as part of a IAEA monitoring team. That would be a rather significant development. You've got the issue of sunsets. Will there be any? My point is, you've got this monster of a challenge. You've got a president whose clock is running very fast. You have an Israeli prime minister whose clock is running even faster. And I just at some point in this negotiation, they have to start exchanging detailed texts. I mean, I may not be 150-page JCPOA, but I'm quoting the words of the Hollywood mogul Samuel Goldwyn, who said an oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on. The fact is, any negotiation needs to produce a text. And it has to have some measure of detail. And I just wonder whether or not this is even envisioned. You can't do this on the back of a cocktail napkin.
I think that actually gradually dawned on the U.S. because, initially the president said, okay, in 2 months we're going to do this, which was, even in the best of circumstances, extremely ambitious. And then, a negotiation process in which you meet for 1 day every week and there's no sustained discussion is not going to yield results in 2 months. And so there is now more talk of coming up with an interim agreement that actually would create time. But the problem is not just what you said, David, and to your list of things they need to resolve, I also will add the issue of stockpiles. I mean, Iran has an enormous amount of stockpile of 20% and 60% enriched uranium that have to be resolved. But all of these have to look better than JCPOA. And Suzanne's right, that's not an easy lift. Iran may be much more to give on transparency and inspection than it is willing to give on let's say, enrichment. But the other issue is that there is a clock running. There is a meeting of the Board of Governors of IAEA on June 9-10, I believe, which, if there's no progress, it could give Iran a bad billing of health on its nuclear issue, which then could be used by Europeans, either in coordination with the White House or independent of the White House, to essentially start the process for snapback sanctions at the at the United Nations, which they've threatened that they want to do. And that Iran has said would lead to it leaving the non-proliferation treaty, etc. In other words, there's not an open-ended time. In fact, partly the next rounds of negotiations between US and Iran might not be on the nuclear issue at all, but might be on how do they manage the next 2-3 months that the schedule of things that could happen does not derail the talks. Because, IAEA and snapback could essentially change the atmosphere completely. And they need to find even mechanisms about how they're going to manage that.
That might argue for a piece of paper, the much either maligned or praised idea of a framework. You mentioned framework at the outset, Vali, and I think framework would seem to be, whether it's announced or not, is critically important. And if you don't know where you're going, then any road you take is likely to get you there. And that's a critically important point, as is the issue of comprehensiveness. I'm assuming both of you would, I shouldn't assume, let me just ask, this agreement, should it materialize, would be one that would address the nuclear issue without taking on the complicated matter of ballistic missiles, human rights, proxies. Is that Suzanne, to you, is that?
Well, I think that's an open question, right? Then one of the big critiques of the JCPOA was the fact that it did not incorporate Iran's missile stockpile and missile transfers around the region, even though that had been included in the UN Security Council resolutions that had actually led to the negotiations. So, I think where this goes and where it lands is going to be a very interesting barometer of where the Republican Party is moving with respect to foreign policy issues. Will we see some of the more prominent voices from the Republican Senate caucus criticize a deal that does not, in fact, go beyond the parameters of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? Will they be willing to criticize President Trump on an issue which is something that he will certainly trumpet if, in fact, he's able to get a deal? I would anticipate, if this were a normal administration, that senators like Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz would be highly critical of a deal that did not go well beyond the 2015 deal, that did not, in fact, stop enrichment in Iran, that did, in fact, deal with the missiles and some of the other issues that were not included in the original deal. But I don't know under the current circumstances. And so I think this is going to be a very interesting test case.
It would, particularly if the Iranians insist on Senate ratification, to avoid the problem of 2018, where this president in his first term withdrew from an agreement that he clearly wants to somehow negotiate in his second. And it's not a normal administration, by the way, Suzanne. I think we all understand that. Which, frankly, given the president's control of the Republican Party, could prove to be an asset. Okay, we have some time left, and I want to ask the it's not a heretical question, but when we were offline, I asked both of you to consider it. And it is this. Since 2018, when the first Trump administration withdrew from, I would argue, a flawed but highly functional JCPOA, we've lived in a no war, no peace, and I use the term very loosely, relationship. You've seen 2 Israeli strikes on Iranian territory and 2 Iranian strikes on Israeli territory. But the massive Israeli strike, the US strike against Iran, and the possibility of responding strikes against Saudi Arabia, US forces, a whole range of unpleasantness. Is it possible to imagine, if in fact no deal is reached, that this no war, no peace situation continues with a series of informal understandings that the Biden administration, I suspect, may have reached with Iran to keep things from escalating, which would mean no attacks on American forces in the region. It would mean maintaining its relationship with the IAEA and no dramatic advances in terms of enrichment. Could you imagine another 7 years without some resolution in the next 2 years to the issue of Iran's nuclear program? Vali, to you first.
I mean, 7 years is a long time. I don't think that kind of a scenario would be sustainable in the long term, particularly because I think the domestic situation in Iran also cannot exist either in the current circumstance or something worse for a prolonged period of time. But I do think that if this round of talks comes to an end, I don't think it's war right away. I mean, Israel may want it, but Israel cannot do it either with U.S. Giving it a go-ahead, providing it with airspace to get to Iran through its lines, and then also providing the kind of support that Israel needs in order to do the damage that it wants to do. And then for President Trump, there's a lot to consider about what a war with Iran might mean. I mean, his calculations may be very different from Israel's. And so I think I'm not sure they would go there. I think we might be in a period where if this round fails, if things, both sides cannot come up with something creative to keep the talks going, that both of them may decide that they need to change the other one's calculus. So they may back off and try to exert pressure on the other side in the anticipation that the talks would be rejoined 6 months from now, a year from now. And I think that's a more likely scenario. But then, things may get out of control in the meantime. I mean, things can happen that you don't anticipate. I think there's another factor here, although we might not have time to talk about it, is the Gulf is not at all easy about this. The body language of the Gulf is not confident in what Israel is prescribing, or is not confident at all in what war might mean for them. And I think that's important in the U.S. calculation as well.
Suzanne?
I'll agree entirely with Vali. I think that it's a very unsteady equilibrium at the moment. And while it's unlikely that the Israelis would attack, knowing that they would not necessarily be able to count on American support, I do think we are dealing with a different, sort of psyche in Israel today in terms of what they can live with in terms of threats to the existence of the state of Israel. And so it is possible that we will see not a full-scale attempt to eliminate the nuclear program, but I can imagine a world in which the same calculus which drove the Israelis to take out the air defense system in October might drive additional pinpoint attacks, additional covert activities, and you could see an escalatory spiral emerging as a result of that. I think what is very clear is that the Trump administration does not want to see itself sucked into another war in the Middle East, knowing that both economic and political costs and the strategic trade-offs that entails. And that, as Vali said, the key powers in the Gulf, key U.S. partners in the Gulf, are very much averse and are willing to put their own, sort of relationships on the line in order to prevent anyone from getting, overly ambitious about how easy it might be to take out the Iranian nuclear program. So my bet is that if we don't see a deal, we see this kind of precarious instability in the region continue, where, as Vali said, there will be attempts by both sides to try to change the calculus of the other, and we could find ourselves in another crisis.
Yeah, I guess it puts a very heavy burden on Mr. Witkoff to deliver. I think we've come to the end of our 45 minutes. Again, I'm always amazed. The discussion has been rich and with granular detail and as well as conception. I want to thank both of you for coming on, and once again for the third time. Selling books is not easy, but it's important. Iran's Grand Strategy: A Political History by Vali Nasr. I would recommend it. Take care, and thanks again, you two.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.